All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming here. It's a beautiful Kolkata evening here, and the weather is lovely. It's a beautiful venue. Thank you for being here. For those of you who are still coming in from the back, feel free to sit as close to the action as you'd like. And we're definitely going to do some Q&A, so have a think about things you'd like to ask these two wonderful authors that we have here today. I'm Ravi Agrawal, and I'm your host for this session today. And the session is titled Beyond History's Icons. More on that in a second, but before we get there, I just want to give both of our authors a proper introduction because I know we were switching things over when they were first name called. So first up, to my immediate left, we have Deborah Baker. She is the author of, most recently, The Last Englishman, Love, War, and the End of Empire. It is a superb book, and I really urge you to go buy it either immediately after this session or online, wherever you go. If they don't have books, there are other bookstores that you can find them at. She is also the author of other books, such as A Blue Hand, The Beats in India, The Convert, just to name a few. But I have to say that, apart from her books, Debbie, one of the things that makes her very special here today is that she is a Kolkata Bahu. She was married in this very city, and so in that sense, this is her second home. So a special round of applause for Debbie. Our second guest here is Simon Sebag Montefiore. You may have heard him yesterday when he was speaking here, and it was a great session. Simon is truly a polymath. He is an award-winning historian and also a novelist, so he's adept at telling stories both real and imagined. He's been published in 48 languages, which is amazing. I've been published in one. And he has written too many books for me to name right here, but they include the likes of Jerusalem, the Romanovs, Stalin, Young Stalin, and his book, Catherine the Great, is being turned into a movie by Angelina Jolie. So let's have a big round of applause for Simon as well, please. Two wonderful guests, and what are we going to talk about? We are going to talk about, well, the session's title is Beyond History's Icons, and we all know that the history of the world as we know it has been shaped by great figures, figures that are larger than life, figures that become, because of their actions, household names. Think of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Stalin, Hitler, China's Mao. Closer to home, you have Mahatma Gandhi, who's been a big figure in these discussions over the past 2 or 3 days. Netaji, who we marked yesterday, of course. But behind all of these famous, larger-than-life figures, there are always other characters, characters who are lesser known, characters who you may not have always heard of, characters who still end up having a unique role in shaping history and whose stories shed unique light on where we are today and on historical events. So using that as our route into our discussion today, I'm going to start with Debbie. And Debbie, I loved your book, The Last Englishman, and while most of us here have heard of the poets W.H. Auden and Stephen Spender, you ended up picking their older brothers, lesser-known older brothers, as roots into this grander, bigger, amazing story. Tell us about that.
Well, my original intention was to write a book set in Calcutta during the war. I felt we in the West have heard so many stories about the Blitz and Normandy invasions. And, Calcutta also had very profound experiences during the war. And so I was sort of looking for subjects or characters that could carry a narrative that would bring me through Calcutta during the war up to independence. And sort of, in a roundabout way, I ended up coming across this correspondence between W.H. Auden and his older brother, John Auden, who lived in Calcutta from 1926 to 1953. And John Auden worked for the Geological Survey of India, but his passion was the Himalayas. and he aspired to be included on one of the expeditions to Mount Everest, because during the 30s, England was very focused on putting an Englishman on top of Mount Everest, and there were 4 expeditions to Everest during the 30s. None of them were, as you probably know, were successful. And I sort of, through John Auden's papers, which ended up at the New York Public Library, I came across this correspondence that he had with his younger brother Whiston, but also this letter from Michael Spender, who was on one of the expeditions to Everest. Michael Spender was a kind of polymath. He was trained in cartography, map making, and surveying. So the British only had access to Everest from the north through Tibet. So they had to come through Calcutta, go to Darjeeling, and from there on through Tibet up the north face of Everest. And so Michael was tasked on a reconnaissance to do a very detailed this new technology called stereogrammetry that enabled him to use photographs to make a very detailed map of the north face of Everest that would help the climbers figure out what route they could take to the summit. So just sort of looking at the papers, looking at the correspondence between John and Stephen, and Michael, I found that they had fallen in love with the same woman in 1938 between the Anschluss and Munich crisis. I found this sort of triangular love story that brought me to both London and Calcutta during the war.
And it's really a wonderful book. We're going to talk more about this, but you must read it if you haven't yet. I'm going to bring in Simon as well. Simon, you're a real expert on Russia. Several of your books go into great depth into Russian history, famous Russians like Stalin, of course, the Romanovs. You've written about Catherine the Great, as I mentioned. And I can completely see why you use these characters to tell sort of their stories, but also use them to tell larger stories about the setting and the time and the period and the people involved in those moments. But, since we're here today trying to look at sort of lesser known characters, do you want to maybe spend a few minutes telling us about characters that you haven't actually written about in that much detail, but who may in some senses also be able to explain the moments that you focused on?
Yeah, and I think this is, and I agree with Deborah, I agree with both of you that this is a great idea because we spend far too much time debating and redebating Gandhi, Stalin, and Churchill, just to name 3 20th century titans. And actually, in my books, it's funny that I was asked to do this topic because I regard my books as kind of treasure chests of lesser-known characters who are fascinating in their own right. And oftentimes, I spend a lot of time researching these characters in great detail. And I'll give you an example. This is someone who is close to Stalin. Now, Stalin was an expert at finding tools for his plans. And many of his tools were henchmen from later in his career, like Beria, who we can talk about, for example, or Yezhov, who were the secret police chiefs, who were fascinating. But I want to go back right to the beginning of his life, to a lesser-known period. And when he was growing up in Gori, Stalin was born in Georgia, as you know. His name was Djugashvili, Soso Djugashvili. And when he was growing up there, he played with a little boy from an Armenian family called Kerpetrosian. And this little boy was always nicknamed Camo. And Camo his father was a very rich merchant who supplied the Russian army. Stalin was a drunken cobbler's son who was literally living in a hovel. And later, after they'd both been to their schools, they met up, and Stalin was a young Bolshevik revolutionary. And Camo was I would say, a natural-born killer, a psychopath, a master of disguise. And Stalin needed a hatchet man. He needed many in his life, and every revolutionary does. And he chose Camo. Now, Camo could do things like, Camo could dress as a woman. He could dress as a princess and enter a ball dressed in full female clothing, a ball gown, bare shoulders, makeup, with a wig on. and people would think he was a woman. He actually did that. He was also capable of dressing as an aristocrat. He had many uniforms in his closet, and he could dress up as a prince, as a general. Now, when Stalin wanted someone killed, he normally got Camo to do it. Camo also had a weird other talent, and this was that he didn't feel pain.
Wow.
He actually had a psychological, a condition.
Like medically, he didn't feel pain.
Medically. So when he was tortured by the secret police, which I'll come to if I can, he felt no pain. He had all his fingernails pulled out. He was burnt, he just laughed.
Wow.
So he was a very strange person, quite good looking. Now, when Stalin decided to do his bank robbery, the big bank robbery, which, funny enough, they're making a movie of this, of young Stalin, my book.
Right.
And the opening scene of this is Stalin's bank robbery. And it was the biggest bank robbery in Europe at the time. They stole the equivalent of about $50 million.
Wow.
500,000 rubles. And in the process, because Stalin was organizing it, about 50 bystanders were killed. And what they did was, all the money for paying all of the employees of the Tsar, all the bureaucrats in the south of Russia, arrived in a carriage. They arrived by train and then came by carriage to the state bank. And Stalin and Camo and their gang, who included some very pretty student girls, all of them armed to the teeth, threw grenades underneath the horses,
Wow.
killed all the Cossacks and guards, and stole the money. Now, just when they thought they'd stolen the money, one of the horses got up and pulled the carriage away, but another psychopath blew up the horse, and Camo rode along. Now, he was dressed as the chief of police. And this time, he was in full police uniform. So he just rode along, and he took the money, and they put all the money bags into his carriage, and he rode back the way the carriage had come. And as he did so, he passed the deputy head of police, the real deputy head of police, and they stopped their carriages, and the deputy chief of police said, "What's happened? Have they got the money?" He said, "No, it's all fine, but they need you that way." So he rode off with the money, and the deputy chief of police committed suicide afterwards because he'd missed the money. Then when they wanted to send the money to Lenin, who was in Finland, Camo dressed up as a prince and wearing a full regalia and golden shoulder boards. He pretended to be with his new bride, and they carried the money in their wedding presents to Lenin.
I can see how this would be the opening sequence of a movie. It makes complete sense.
So there's a character. I mean, he is the most fascinating. Camo is one of the most fascinating characters, minor characters in all of history.
But deserving of his own biography, clearly.
He should have his own biography. And just to finish quickly, because I know that's gone on rather long, but he was a real psychopath. He later tried to smuggle the money to change the notes and was captured in Berlin, tortured by the police, sentenced to death, escaped, and then when Stalin came to power in 1917, Camo was quite an embarrassment to Stalin because Stalin did not want anyone to know that he'd been a bank robber, even though it was for the Bolshevik Party. So Stalin got him a minor job in an undercover special operations unit. And while he was there, Camo went even crazier and conducted tests on the young commandos, which included killing a man and pulling his heart out in front of them. Wow. So even the Bolsheviks, this was too much, so he was sacked. And then he went back to Tbilisi, no one knew what to do with him. And then one day he was bicycling around Tbilisi in 1919, and a truck, drove over and killed him. And the joke was in Soviet Russia, that obviously Stalin had murdered him because he was riding the only bicycle in Tbilisi, and he was killed by the only truck.
Wow. I mean, that clearly deserves its own biography, and maybe you're the person to write that, clearly. Debbie, you have a wonderful way of sort of describing Calcutta in your book, and you have this great character, Sudhindranath Datta, and your descriptions of him, I thought, were at once quite funny, but also melancholy. And this is part where you say that he was a product of the marriage of England and Bengal as much as his cousins. And then he goes and travels the world and comes back. And when he comes back, he writes that, you couldn't imagine a more ill-assorted metropolis as he came back to Calcutta. And I thought that was a very interesting line, just given what it's like to leave Calcutta and come back, which is something I've experienced as well. Tell us a little bit more about Sathin Datta, how you sort of traced his journey, and how his story also was a route into explaining this moment in Calcutta that you cover in the book.
Well, Sudhindranath was John Auden's best friend, his only really close Indian friend. But Sudhin had a wide circle of intellectuals, academics, young communists who all attended his Adda and often published in his literary magazine, which was called Porichoy. And it was through there was a secret diarist who attended this Adda who was sort of in awe of all the intellects who were sort of sparkling and on display. And he would go home and he would talk about who said what and what they were wearing and how many sweets they ate. And it was this great source for me because they were arguing about politics. They were arguing about what was going on in Europe at the time. They were trying to figure out what Japan was doing in China. And it really helped me get a sense. And Sudhin was very much directing the conversation. And it really helped me get a sense of all the various, intellects that were shaping opinion in Calcutta at the time and how they viewed England's prospects in a war against Germany, how England's Air Force, the RAF, would hold up against the Wehrmacht. And so that was a very useful thing. So when I wanted to write about Calcutta's experience for the war, it was really through Sudhin's point of view and what Sudhin would write to John Auden in his letters, when John was off in the Himalayas, doing his geological work.
Right. And you and I have chatted about this before, but, one of the things, bit part players can be people, but they can also be countries and regions. And so, for example, in the telling of World War II in the popular imagination, you have Dunkirk and D-Day, and all of these movies that tend to lionize the role of the West and the role of Churchill, for example, and yet, sitting here in Calcutta, the story is quite different.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, as most of you know, Calcutta was first inundated by refugees from Burma, a lot of them Bengalis who were living in Burma when the Japanese started bombing Burma. And it really looked like, and Calcutta itself was bombed. And Sudhin later left the Adda and he went, all the communists were totally against giving any kind of support to the Allies until Hitler turned on Stalin. But he went to work, he looked after the building of bomb shelters in Calcutta so that people would have a place to go when Calcutta was being bombed. And then when Japanese appeared to stop bombing Calcutta, those bomb shelters became shelters for the hundreds of thousands of starving peasants who were coming in from the countryside during the famine of 1943. So, and he turned the bomb shelters into relief centers as the director of the person that was in charge of looking after Calcutta. So he really had a sort of street side view of what Calcutta went through during those years.
Yeah, and he's a fascinating character through which to see what happened in those years. I like the idea of a city as a character in a wider global sphere, in a regional sphere, in a historical sense. And Simon, you've written this amazing biography of Jerusalem, the city, and of course you have a personal connection to Jerusalem, a family connection to Jerusalem. And I remember in your book you said that Jerusalem has a way of disappointing and tormenting both conquerors and visitors. What did you mean by that? And give us a sense of Jerusalem as as a character through history, but now also in its modern role.
Yeah, I also like this idea of you're talking about Calcutta, showing an area and a time through a city, and I think that's a lovely idea. And that is also what I was trying to do with my Jerusalem, which is called Jerusalem the Biography, because I wanted to treat Jerusalem as a personality almost. And though it's not a minor personality in history, Jerusalem, it's one of the I call it not just the holy city, but the universal city. It's also weirdly a city that has had no kind of strategic importance whatsoever in history. And throughout its long story, it's always been away from the trade routes. It's on a sort of baked Judean mountain, and it's always been quite small. So it doesn't really have any. It's not on a river or a port or whatever, and yet it's so much. It's so much in all of our imaginations, and so that was one of the things I was trying to do when I was writing it, and of course, by treating it as a personality, of course, in the Bible, in the Jewish and Christian Bibles, Jerusalem is constantly described as a person. In the Jewish scriptures, Jerusalem is always described as a beautiful princess. When things are good, it's described as Jerusalem is a beautiful princess in red and bright blue azure robes, her hair perfumed. When Jerusalem is destroyed, as happens twice, totally, and there are about 40 sieges and untold massacres and wars, she's described as a fallen princess who's in rags with ashes in her hair.
And the amazing thing there is that on the one hand, Jerusalem is an evolving city over time, and its role has changed. Its role is very different now than it was 200 years ago. It is now, you said it's not vital in global affairs. Now it is very vital in global affairs. But also, crucially, it holds an imaginative purpose for Jews around the world, many of who may never have been there before, but they see it as a spiritual home of sorts.
That's right. It's in the imaginations, and in the Middle Ages, every single village in every single church, in every single village, in every single town in the whole of Europe, from the Urals to the Americas, to the edge of the coast of Spain, had a Jerusalem hall, a Jerusalem chamber, and that chamber was filled with paintings of Jerusalem, which was a completely fantastical Christian version of Jerusalem. And one of the features of Jerusalem is that each successive conqueror, each successive empire, each successive faith have arrived in Jerusalem and found Jerusalem wanting, disappointing, not exactly what they hoped for. And in each case, they've tried to rebuild a Jerusalem that does suit them, that does fulfill their fantasy, their vision. So, when the Crusaders arrived, for example, they killed everybody in the town, men, women, and babies. The place stank. 6 months later, it still stank of rotting cadavers. But they immediately kind of started converting Jerusalem into a Christian Christian city. So this is why one of the weird features of Jerusalem is that there's a condition, a mental condition called the Jerusalem syndrome, or the Jerusalem madness.
Explain what that is.
And it's people still suffer from it today, and it is caused by the difference between the expectation of Jerusalem and the reality. So, for example, pilgrims arrive all the time in Jerusalem, and they literally expect it to be white marble, clean, everyone in white robes, holding crosses, God with a white beard smiling from the clouds. And when they arrive, they find it's full of very rude Israelis and Palestinians. It's filthy, it's dusty, there are queues of buses, it's boiling hot. So some people go mad, and actually, there's a hospital there that specializes in the Jerusalem syndrome, and I actually went there in the millennium year, just after the millennium, and I was shown around by a doctor, and I said to him, so why are there so many people here? He said, it's the millennium. They've all come, and they're very disappointed. Nothing's happened. And so I said, show me around. So he took me into the room for men, and I said, who are all these men? There are about 200 men in this room. And he said, this is one of the very few rooms in the world where if you enter the room and shout, Jesus Christ, everybody will turn round because all of them thought they were either Jesus Christ or John the Baptist. And in the female ward, it was the same with Mary Magdalene or the Virgin Mary. So that's the Jerusalem syndrome.
Bit part players all who think they're much more than that. We're going to come to you in the audience for questions in a few minutes. So have a think about the things you'd like to put to our two wonderful authors here. And if you've just joined us, we're here to discuss characters, clearly if they're just people or cities who are bit part players or who are not as iconic as some of the great names you often see in biographies. And we may have diverted a little bit because we've been talking about Jerusalem, which is clearly an iconic city, but interesting nonetheless. Debbie, I want to come to you with a more fun question. We were playing a game with Ram Guha, the historian, yesterday, and we said that we were just wondering that there were so many great biographies waiting to be written of Indians, but also global figures. Who are your sort of top picks of people that all of us know here, but who haven't had great biographies written of them?
Oh gosh. Well, you know, I always feel like everybody's already been written about, but he suggested, when he was on stage, and that's what I was really interested in, M.F. Hussein and Ravi Shankar, you know, both global figures, and yet...
And colorful figures.
And colorful figures, and deeply, globally significant figures. So, I mean, that is a subject that, you know, someone should take on, you know, who art historians or... but I also feel like there are a lot of subjects that have been written about. They've been written about in hagiographic ways that could be taken down a notch. And when I was in college, I was a researcher on a biography of Churchill for a very well-known historian. And I was in the archives, you know, taking notes and things like that. But it was only, and I had accepted this Western view of Churchill as, you know, the savior of democracy. But it was only when I was sort of really getting into the research on this book that I began to understand, you know, from a Calcutta perspective or an Indian perspective, how incredibly destructive a force he was.
Yeah.
And how, you know, India could have, you know, achieved independence, could have achieved more constitutional independence much sooner if he hadn't been this sort of throwback, Victorian throwback. And also that he was, you know, fundamentally responsible for the famine. You know, it was his call that was, you know, starving the city. And he had really, despite the fact that he would describe, you know, India as the jewel in the crown, he really had nothing but contempt for Indians, and Bengalis in particular. He would completely, you know,
and it was incredibly racist as
very
well.
Very racist. And, you know, he felt like, well, you know, they can afford to lose a few million people because, you know, they breed like rabbits. I mean, that was the level of his sympathy for the plight of Bengal during 1943-44.
And in a sense, in sort of lionizing characters like Churchill and sort of creating this outsized role and depiction of the things they've done at the expense of other tellings of stories and other perspectives.
Right.
I mean, don't you think we're then sort of doomed to continue that sort of telling and therefore interpretation, and it becomes cyclical?
I think so. And what Churchill managed to do is he managed to portray England as this sort of tiny little island, you know, holding off this huge, you know, the huge German military complex all by itself, you know, and yet on the other hand, playing the empire card, and he wanted to have it both ways as the sort of little England under siege and the plucky East Enders, but at the same time, you know, having his war machine completely subsidized, not only by India, but also by America, and feel that he should be able to call the shots in terms of where resources were spent. And not to mention 500,000 Indian soldiers being mobilized, you know, every month.
Yeah, and from the region as well.
Yes.
It wasn't just India.
No, it wasn't just India. It was, all over Africa and Malaysia.
Right, right. And sort of in tribute to that, you can see maybe a couple of small monuments in London, but really nothing the scale and size.
Nothing the scale and size compared to what they have on the Blitz.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to come to you. Anyone has any questions yet? Raise your hand so I can get a sense of, I see one there, I see another there. Okay, we're going to come to you. If we have a lady there who has a mic, if you can begin to inch your way towards a couple of the people here who have questions, be prepared, have a mic in your hand. And while we're waiting for that, as the mic makes its way over, Simon, I'm going to come back to you in the meantime and take us into the present a little bit. And so you've, studied Russia to such a great degree through all of these historic moments and historic characters and people. And while we are talking about bit part players today, there's a player today who hasn't been written of in a historical sense, but we are living and dealing with his actions in every single way, geopolitically, Vladimir Putin. What's your sense? And you've, I think, described in an interview recently how Putin's interference in the 2016 US elections was probably the greatest act of Russian espionage in history. Give us a sense, just through your reading of Russian history and great Russian figures, where Putin would figure and where he sees himself in that pantheon.
Well, I think, funny enough, Putin does fit into our discussion here, but in a funny sort of way, because Putin was chosen as a sort of bit player, almost at random by a drunken and declining Boris Yeltsin, and he was actually chosen by Yeltsin's daughter and son-in-law to be president. And they were desperate to find somebody, and they were looking for somebody, and they finally said, I think we found somebody who's kind of no nonsense, but there was no kind of promise that he would be any sort of statesman at all. So he could have been the accidental president. But I have to tell you that anyone who is able to not only dominate but thrive in the Kremlin for 19, 20 years is no accident. Ruling Russia is one of the most terrifying and challenging prospects. And the reason for this, as you know, Donald Trump, I think, has a sort of schoolboy crush on Putin. Growing up in Queens among, with all those kind of mafia characters like it's shown in The Godfather, I think he grew up, thinking like, it'd be a great thing to be able to kind of whack people sometimes, and with his kind of innate contempt for democracy, I think he kind of looked around the world, and who was the sort of greatest figure who could seem to be able to do exactly what he wanted? Vladimir Putin.
No checks and balances.
But I think that actually, I think he misunderstands much, he misunderstands that too, because though a Russian leader, a Russian autocrat like Putin, appears to have absolute power, and certainly he can, intervene in Syria without any interference from his parliament or press or anybody, or Ukraine for that matter. Actually, a ruler without boundaries also is a ruler without sort of inbuilt defenses. And in a way, it's only with the most ferocious vigilance that he can survive in the bear pit of the Kremlin. And of course, one of the fascinating things about these Russian rulers is they can't retire, for example. Yeltsin couldn't retire unless he'd found a non-entity, as he thought, who would guarantee his family and entourage against prosecution. And the same will be true for Putin. And that's why Putin, he happens to be very good at this, but he also can't retire. And so the succession is a real problem. And I think he could be in power for 20 more years,
Very easily.
But what I said about the security thing is interesting because, it was always the KGB's dream situation to create a division between the security services, the CIA and the FBI, and a serving American commander-in-chief, president. And they've somehow managed that. So, yes, that is the great dream of Russian espionage. But the funny thing is, they never expected Trump to win, because they presumed that American elections are always fixed. So they presumed that Hillary Clinton was always going to win. They just wanted to cause as much trouble and undermine it as much as possible. So they got a big surprise, like the rest of us.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take a few audience questions now. I have a lady over there, so if you can tell us your name and a question, please, and direct it at either one of our authors here, or it could be a general one.
Hi, my name is Priyanka. Thank you for the stories. It was so interesting, but my question, simply put, is what about the women? You don't tell us the story of W.H. Auden, rather the story of John Auden, and not the story of Stalin, but rather the story of Camus. But what about John Auden's lover? What about the beautiful women throwing the bombs? You know, where do I find their stories, and who's going to tell their stories? And is anybody going to tell their story? You know,
Debbie.
I think that's a really good question, and I do have two women characters in my book. They're both painters. One is a London painter, and one is a Bengali painter. She is the granddaughter of W.C. Banerjee, who was the first Indian president of the Indian National Congress. And so I tell both their stories and their efforts to become independent of their husbands and their lovers, and and to continue to do their art. But they're all minor characters, but their stories are woven into the stories of John Auden and also Sudan's own failed romances. So, I construct it novelistically, so you don't know who's going to end up with whom. But these women are very big parts of the story.
Yeah, well, I have written a biography of Catherine the Great, so there's one hell of a woman.
but she was Catherine the Great. You know, what about these women, the bombers you mentioned? You know.
Well, actually, there's quite a lot about them in the book, actually,
Okay.
and but not just that, but they were students, in fact, and they were studying philosophy, and there are pictures of them in the book and so on. So there's quite a lot about them, as much as it could be known, I found. And in fact, I mean, one of the fascinating things about working in the archives about young Stalin was that there were many very independent female Bolshevik conspirators and revolutionaries, some of whom married leaders, some of them became leaders themselves. But the Russians were extremely chauvinistic, and when they got to power, when Stalin got to power, talking about a Victorian throwback, I mean, he was very much a sort of Victorian man who didn't want women anywhere and distrusted political women. But actually, just to mention two other women that I think are fascinating while we're on the subject. In Jerusalem, one of the heroines of Jerusalem is Queen Melisande, who really built, who was the Crusader Queen of Jerusalem in her own right. And she built pretty much the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as we see it today, and all the markets of Jerusalem. And so she's a pretty big character in that book, I have to say, and a pretty impressive politician. She was the sort of Margaret Thatcher or Indira Gandhi of the Crusades. And one other person I have to mention, one of the strange things about Russia in the 18th century was that this most chauvinistic of countries, by a strange sort of quirk of history, had more Russian female leaders than virtually any other country in Europe, in their own right. And I've just got to mention, just to name check them, I mean, Peter the Great's wife became Catherine the First, not Catherine the Second, the Great. She started as a camp follower. She's first glimpsed being as a prisoner of war, being taken into a camp, naked except for a blanket. She became the lover of powerful men. But in the end, she became the first empress of Russia in her own right, in all of history, and was a really formidable character. And one other female ruler of Russia in the 18th century who's absolutely fascinating, and there's a lot of, in the Romanovs, it's full of these female characters, because I'm the only person who's really done big research on them, funny enough. But the other one, who's very much of our fluid sexual times, was called Anna Leopoldovna. She was regent of Russia. She had a ménage à trois with a baroness who was her rather beautiful lady-in-waiting, and with her lover and fiancé, and they have letters between the three of them in a triangular way, and they all call each other he, she throughout all the letters. And this is in 1740. So again, this is very, very much, this is probably about the most modern relationship I've ever written about in my history books. It's straight out of 2019.
And Bengal also had a tradition of schoolgirl assassins. I mean, they were terrorists. They were joining in all these rural insurgencies. So, I mean, you should dig up those stories.
Yeah, those are great stories to tell. And I think, you know, this is part of a larger global conversation as well about diversity in journalism, diversity in the types of people who are telling stories. And so we need more women writers, quite simply. And if that's something you're thinking about, I really hope you go on to tell those stories as well, because we need more Debbies who are, you know, unearthing these stories you know, from a female perspective. And of course, Simon clearly has also written about so many women, but I do think diversity in terms of who is telling these stories helps as well. More questions. I noticed a hand over there and a hand here. Let's go to the one at the back first, if we can, please. The gentleman in gray, as it seems like. Behind you.
Well, I am Sandeep Banerjee. My question is to you that, do you think, according to the international history of the great characters, do you think that from West Bengal, once Nobel Prize winner, poet Rabindranath Tagore is a famous person to utter his name? Can you tell something?
Let's also take another couple of questions so we can address them together. Yes, the gentleman here in white, if we can have a mic make its way to him. And meanwhile, if there's anyone else, put your hand up and we'll get a mic to you. Yes, sir?
My question is to Simon. A lesser-known character in Russian history is Alexander Ilyich Ulyanov. Had he not been executed by Tsar, could we get Lenin? That's what.
Okay, well, that's a very fascinating question. I mean, Alexander Ilyich Ulyanov, you know, was Lenin's elder brother who was executed for attempting to kill Alexander III. And it's said that he was, you know, Lenin, it was embitterment and grief that led Lenin to become a Bolshevik leader. And I can't answer that question, of course. No one can. But it's a fascinating theory. I personally think he'd still have been Lenin. But it's a good question. And it's fascinating looking at these lesser characters. And I do think that the theme that really what we're all discussing here is a danger of overexposure in a way of these giant characters. I mean, we've mentioned Churchill. I don't agree with all your analysis of Churchill, by the way, I should say. I mean, I really do think Britain really was in a crisis in 1914, despite the vast resources of the empire. But anyway, that's another discussion. But I think that, you know, I'm guilty of it as myself. I've written biographies of Stalin and Catherine the Great. And in England, everyone writes biographies of Henry VIII, and we're sick of hearing about the Tudors. But these are sort of brand names of history. And I do think it's fascinating to do what you've done, for example, and reach behind these characters and find new characters who are fascinating. So that's, I guess, I think this is a worthy theme for a session. So I really appreciate all your questions and thoughts.
And of course, Tagore is an iconographic figure, and he has had many biographies. But how interesting it would be to write about some of the women that were around him and the kinds of facets that they brought out in him and the kinds of poems and songs and paintings that, you know, they helped inspire him on. So, you know, maybe you can't just look at a single solitary figure in isolation. You have to look at him as he is seen by the people closest to him. And in his case, that would be, you know, the women that so moved him.
That's a great answer. I'm told we have time for just one more quick question. Anyone? I noticed there's a hand up over there in the middle. So, sir, your name and a very quick question, and we'll try and get to it quickly.
Hello, my name is Shopnil, and my question is to Sir Simon. The question is, Rasputin was a very controversial character in the later part of the Romanov dynasty. So before the Romanov dynasty was executed by the Bolsheviks, it was said that Rasputin held the reins of power behind the palace. So would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, Rasputin is a fascinating character. I go into great detail about him. And you're right, he's one of those, he's almost so famous that he's kind of a lead character. And in fact, a friend of mine, Douglas Smith, has just published a brilliant biography of him, which is about 1,000 pages long. But the truth of Rasputin is even more fascinating than the myth. The myth is that he was, of course, sexually a sexual libertine, an uneducated peasant who came to dominate the royal family because he could cure and staunch the bleeding of the hemophiliac son of Nicholas and Alexandra, Tsarevich Alexei. The truth is even more fascinating. He really did become incredibly powerful during World War I. And the letters between Nicholas and Alexandra, which I quote in the book, the Romanov book, show just how influential he was and how much he distorted politics. So, yeah, he was a fascinating character. There were many surprising things about him, too, and I think just one of them is that, yes, he was able to calm the sick boy when he was having one of his hemophiliac attacks. But the one thing that I found fascinating is that actually Nicholas and Alexandra couldn't really function without him either. And for them, he really served as a sort of psychiatrist, priest, guru, and inspirer of life, a charismatic advisor that they needed just to carry on. And he was unmistakably a bad influence. The people he chose to run the government were a disaster. But do read more about him because, yes, he's a great character. I know we're out of time.
Yeah. So look, on that note, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. And the most important thing with any book event is you have to buy books. So I urge you, after this event, Simon and Debbie are going to make their way to the bookstall over there. Simon has several books that are up there. Debbie has The Lost Englishman. If it's not there, please buy it online or buy it at other stores in Calcutta. She is speaking tomorrow here as well, so you can find her then to get that book signed. And Simon already had an event here yesterday where I know he signed many books. So thank you to both of our excellent authors for a great discussion. Let's have a round of applause. Thank you,
Ravi.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Simon.